Hi, good afternoon. If you're watching this webinar in North America, good morning or good evening if you are watching from some other part of the world. This webinar session is hosted by Council Bar. I would first like to thank them for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about the different ways that you can migrate to Canada. Canada is an in-demand destination, and thousands of persons seek admission to Canada every year. As an immigration attorney, I have assisted a number of persons in Canada who wanted to bring a family member or a relative to live in Canada. And I also assist persons who work outside of Canada that would like to migrate to Canada permanently or would like to come to Canada temporarily to either work, study, or to visit. Now, there are several options that are available for persons to come to Canada. And the good news is that the government has a program whereby they are intending to increase the number of persons who are admitted to Canada each year. Why is Canada an in-demand location? There's several reasons why many persons seek admission to Canada every year. And one of those reasons is because Canada ranks high for being a country that provides quality life. Another reason why many persons seek admission to Canada is because tuition fees in Canada are much, for international students that is, it's much cheaper compared to other countries such as the United States or the United Kingdom. So to discuss the different options that are available to come to Canada, I would first like to talk about the Family Sponsorship Program. Now, the Family Sponsorship Program covers persons who would like to bring a spouse or a dependent child to Canada. And for the purposes of immigration law, a family member is someone who is either a spouse, a common law partner, a conjugal partner, or a dependent child. Other relatives do not qualify as a family member for the purposes of immigration law. So a person that is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident can sponsor a spouse to come to Canada. A spouse is someone that you are married to legally. The marriage must be legal in the country in which it took place, and it must also be recognized in Canada. You can also sponsor a common law partner. A common law partner is someone that you would have been in a relationship with for at least 1 year, and you must have been in a relationship with that person for 12 consecutive months. You can also sponsor a conjugal partner. A conjugal partner is someone that you would have been in a relationship with for 1 year, but that person is outside of Canada, and for circumstances beyond your control, you cannot get married to that person. For example, there's an immigration barrier that is preventing you from getting married to that person, then you may qualify to sponsor that person as a conjugal partner. As I mentioned earlier, another family member is a dependent child. A dependent child is a child that is under the age of 22. So if your child is 22 years or older, that child would not qualify as a dependent child. There are eligibility requirements for the sponsor and also the person that's being sponsored. If you want to sponsor a spouse, a partner, or a dependent child, you must be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. If you are, for example, an undischarged bankrupt, you cannot sponsor a family member to Canada. There is no income requirement that you have to show to sponsor a family member, but you are required to sign an undertaking stating that you would provide for that person's needs for a period of time. And for example, for a spouse or a partner, you sign an undertaking to take care of that person for 3 years. So if that person goes on social assistance within that 3-year period, you would be required to repay the amount of money that that person receives from the government within that period. You are, as a sponsor, you cannot be receiving social assistance. So if you're receiving social assistance, you would not be able to sponsor a spouse or a dependent child. The only exception to that is receiving social assistance, disability assistance. So for example, if you're receiving welfare, you're not eligible. But if you're on disability, then you can sponsor a family member. The other option that many persons use to bring a relative to Canada is the parent and grandparent program. And the parent and grandparent program is only open once every year. The last time that program was open was January 28, 2019. It's normally open just for a few hours because there is a cap on the program. And there are thousands of persons that are applying to the program. So once that cap is reached, the program closes. It's just open once per year. The government had intended to make a number of changes to this program, and it was supposed to be relaunched in April of this year, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, that has been delayed. The difference between sponsoring a family member and a parent or grandparent is that for a parent or grandparent, you do have to meet an income requirement. So some persons, if you've ever researched, the requirements to sponsor a parent or grandparent, you might have come across the word LICO. That means that there's a certain minimum amount of income that you must be earning in order to sponsor a parent or a grandparent. It changes, it goes up a little bit every year. The other requirement that you have the other thing, that I would want to mention with sponsoring a parent or grandparent is that you sign an undertaking to take care of that person for 20 years. So it's a much longer time than the undertaking for a spouse, a partner, or a dependent child. With regard to someone sponsoring a family member or a relative to Canada, there are eligibility requirements for the person that is being sponsored. That is the person that you would like to bring to Canada. And one of the main things is that that person must be admissible to Canada. That means that you're allowed to enter Canada. There are a number of things that makes a person inadmissible to Canada. And for example, if you have a criminal record, you may be inadmissible to Canada. Once you submit an application to come to Canada, you're required to do a police background check. So if you have a criminal record or you have committed an act outside of Canada that is considered an offense in Canada, you may be criminally inadmissible. Persons can also be medically inadmissible to Canada, and persons can be inadmissible to Canada for misrepresentation. Misrepresentation, that is if, for example, you lied in your application or you submitted a previous application. Let's say you came to Canada to visit, and now before you went back home, and now you have a family or a relative here that is sponsoring you, and you lied on the previous application to come to Canada. If immigration finds that out when your new application is being processed, you may be inadmissible to Canada for 5 years for misrepresentation. So there are eligibility requirements for both the person that is sponsoring a relative or family member and also the person that is being sponsored. I would also like to mention, and many persons do not know this, that if you are sponsoring a family member or relative and you've been convicted of a serious criminal violent of a violent criminal offense, or for example sexual assault, you may not be eligible to sponsor that family member or that relative. Of course, there are ways to overcome these inadmissibilities. There are ways to request a waiver. You would need the assistance of a lawyer to be able to do that. One of the other ways that you can bring a relative to Canada is through the Lonely Canadian class. And this is not a class that we hear about often because it is very restricted. In order to bring a relative to Canada, sponsors a relative to Canada through this class, you must show that you do not have any living family members. So you must not have a spouse or a child, a child or a sibling alive, and you must not have a family member who is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident in Canada. And once again, the same eligibility requirements apply for this program. You have to be eligible as the sponsor and as the person being sponsored. I do also want to mention that the province of Quebec has its own immigration requirements. So generally, what you will be hearing from me today will apply to most of the provinces with the exception of Quebec. The other way that you can come to Canada outside of the family sponsorship program. So let's say you're not looking to sponsor a relative, but you're living outside of Canada and you want to come to Canada to live permanently, you can do that through the economic stream. The economic stream, it's one of the most popular streams. It's most of the persons that are admitted to Canada each year are admitted through the economic stream. The processing time for applications through the economic stream are a bit faster for most of the programs. And there are several programs under the economic stream. And one that most persons would be familiar with is the Express Entry program. Now, under this program, you're awarded points based on a number of factors, based on your age, based on your work experience, based on your education, based on your adaptability to Canada. In order to apply through this program, you first have to create a profile. And to create a profile, you have to take a language test. And this language test applies to most of the programs under the economic stream. So you first have to complete what is called either the CELPIP or the IELTS test. And once you've completed this test, you will be able to create a profile where you will enter your personal information, you will enter your work experience, you will enter information about your education, information about your family, whether you're single, you're married, whether you have children. You'll be able to enter all that information, whether you have Canadian work experience, whether you went to school in Canada, and based on the information that you provide in that profile, you will be awarded points. So each month there is a draw and there is a cut-off point. So once you create that profile, you enter into a pool with everyone else who has a profile that qualifies to enter the pool, and there's a draw that's done every month. And if you're selected in that draw, you're invited to apply to live in Canada permanently. There are 3 categories under the Express Entry program. That is the Canadian Experience class. That is the federal one. The second one is the Federal Skilled Worker Program. And there's also the Skilled Worker Program. The Canadian Experience class is for persons who have Canadian work experience. And you must have worked legally. So for example, if you've been living in Canada without status and you've been working, you cannot use that work experience to apply through the Canadian experience class. The experience that you're using must have been obtained on a work permit. It must have been legal. You must have been legally entitled to work in Canada. The Federal Skilled Worker Program is generally for persons who are, most times for persons outside of Canada, they don't have Canadian work experience, but they would like to come to Canada. What I want to mention is that the Federal Skilled Worker Program, the Canadian Experience Class, and the Skilled Worker Program, they all have different requirements, and you can only apply if you have experience in certain occupations. So for example, the Skilled Worker Program in lay terms, I would say would more likely be suitable to somebody who has hands-on experience. So for example, if you're a plumber, an electrician, the Skilled Worker Program may be more fitting for you to apply through. If you have experience in a job that required you to have a Canadian, not a Canadian, but a university degree or diploma, it doesn't have to be a degree or diploma that you earned in Canada. It can be from anywhere. If you have experience in a job that requires you to have a Canadian degree or diploma, then you more likely want to look at the Canadian Experience Class and the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now, as I mentioned, you have to have worked within certain occupations. So there's something called a knock code. If you've ever looked at the Express Entry Program, you would have come across something called a knock code. And every occupation in Canada is given a specific code. In order to come to Canada through this program, you have to find the code that matches your work experience. And under that code, it gives you an example of list of job titles that would qualify. It gives you an example of the duties that you should have performed for that job. So you have to ensure that whatever experience you're using in this Express Entry Program, that it matches the information on the government's website about the knock code for your specific work experience. There is also the Provincial Nominee Program, and the Provincial Nominee Program works in two ways. It works by itself, and it also works through the Express Entry Program. The Provincial Nominee Program is specific to each province. Each province has its own program, and the Provincial Nominee Program exists to meet the labor demands or labor shortage in Canada. So the labor demands, it differs from province to province. So for example, currently there is a demand for persons in the IT field in Ontario. So for example, computer engineers. So Ontario's Provincial Nominee Program is catered towards those persons. In another province, there's a demand for persons in the medical field. So their Provincial Nominee Program is catered towards persons in the medical field. That's one way that the Provincial Nominee Program works. And what you can do is apply directly to the province. The other way that it works is through the Express Entry Program. So let's say, for example, you've created a profile. Your profile is eligible in the Express Entry Program. You've been entered into the pool with everyone else who has an eligible profile. The provinces sometimes select persons from that pool to invite them to apply to come to Canada to live permanently. Another program under the Express Entry stream, and as I mentioned, this is really to give you a general overview, and I'll try my best to cover as much as I can with the different options. Another program is the Home child care provider and home support worker program, and that is through the caregiver stream. Now the caregiver program changes from time to time, and it's been changed as recent as of last year. So this is for persons who want to, let's say there's an employer in Canada that wants to hire somebody to come to Canada to provide care for their children. They would hire somebody outside of Canada to come and work as a caregiver. This program, as I mentioned, has recently changed. In the past, you had to come to Canada, you had to get a work permit, your work permit was very restricted. You had to work with only the employer on your work permit. You had to obtain the 24 months working experience before you can apply for permanent residence. But since last year, when the government made the changes, you submit your permanent residence application before you come to Canada. You're given an open work permit, so you don't have to work with one employer, but you must work within that occupation. So for example, if you come to Canada as a caregiver, you can't work as a teacher and then use that experience working as a teacher to apply through the caregiver program. So though you can work with any employer now, you have to stick within the occupation. So you submit your permanent residence application and all the required documents before you come to Canada. And you come to Canada, you obtain the work experience, and then you provide proof that you have obtained the work experience in order to complete the processing of your permanent resident application under the caregiver program. The costs for these programs vary. So the cost that is involved, it's you pay the application fees to the government, and it differs from program to program. And then you pay the fees to your representative or the lawyer that you have retained to assist you with this would also charge a fee. So there's two sets of fees that are generally involved in applying to these programs. The processing time for these programs also, it varies. So for example, if you're doing an application to sponsor a spouse, the applications are generally processed within 12 months. That's the information that's what the government intends to do, is to process that application within 12 months. If you're applying under the express entry stream, they intend to process your application within 6 months or less. This does not always happen. There may be delays for different reasons. So it might be a bit longer than that time, or sometimes it could even be faster. I've seen both situations working with clients. The other program that's available to come to Canada is the Startup Visa program, and that's specifically for entrepreneurs. That's specifically for persons who want to start a business in Canada. And the eligibility requirements for this program is different from the other programs. You have to show that you're able to support yourself in Canada and to support any of the dependents that you're bringing with you to Canada. And your business has to qualify. There's certain eligibility requirements for your business. Another stream through which you can come to Canada is the Atlantic Pilot Program, and this is specifically for the Atlantic provinces and for employers who are living there that want to meet a labor demand. So let's say there's a labor shortage in certain sectors in those provinces. An employer cannot find a Canadian permanent resident or citizen to fill that vacancy. They can hire a temporary foreign worker, or they can also retain an international student. So this is also applicable. The Atlantic Pilot Program is also applicable to international students who would have studied in these provinces and they want to stay there to work and live permanently. There's also the program for self-employed persons, and that is specifically restricted to persons who work in cultural or athletic activities. And you must be able to show that the as a self-employed person that you will make a contribution to the culture and athletic life in Canada. There is also a program for workers in the agricultural and food sector, and that is to meet the labor shortage in that sector. And this is a new program. It's a 3-year pilot program that the government has recently introduced. And in order to qualify for this program, you must be able to show that you have 1 year full-time Canadian work experience in the agriculture or food sector. And I'm just moving quickly through these programs because I do want to talk a bit about temporary residence, which I will address now. And that's a popular stream in Canada, particularly for persons who want to come to Canada to study, because as I mentioned initially, the tuition fees in Canada are generally much cheaper than, for example, the United States or the United Kingdom. So for temporary residence in Canada, if you want to come to Canada as a student, you're going to be coming as a temporary resident. And you must be accepted into a designated learning institution. A designated learning institution is an institution, a school, a university, a college that has been approved by the province to enroll international students. And what I want to mention here, which is very important, because oftentimes I speak with clients who would have attended a school in Canada, they graduate, they're happy, they received a certificate, a diploma, and then they find out that their school was not a designated learning institution. So you have to ensure that you're accepted to a designated learning institution. The other requirement to come to Canada as a student, you have to show that you are able to, you have enough money to provide for yourself and to pay your tuition cost. You also have to satisfy the officer that you will stay in Canada temporarily. The officer that's reviewing your application wants to be ensured that you're going to leave Canada at the end of your studies. What I do want to mention is that though the officer is looking to see that wants to be convinced that you're going to leave Canada at the end of your studies, it does not mean that when you finish studying at the particular school that you've applied to initially, you can't apply to another program, or you can't apply for another study permit. So you could extend your stay once you've completed that first program that you would have applied to. What is good about studying in Canada also is that you get something called a postgraduate work permit. So a postgraduate work permit is a one-time work permit, and the length of that permit depends on the length of your studies. So the length of the work permit ranges from 1 to 3 years. So if you would have studied in Canada at a designated learning institution for at least 8 months, then you can apply for a postgraduate work permit. What is really good about this work permit is that it's an open work permit. So you can work with any employer in Canada. Of course, there are always restrictions, and that's listed on the work permit. So for example, you can't work in, let's say, like striptease. That's listed on the work permit. There's limited exceptions there. But you can work with generally any employer in Canada. Why you would want to get that postgraduate work permit is that postgraduate work permit would allow you to get Canadian experience. And if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, the Canadian experience class is one of the streams through which you can get permanent residence under the express entry program. So let's say, for example, you come to Canada to study. you have 1 year work experience working in an eligible job in your home country, you would get points under, you may get points under the express entry program for your work experience in your home country. But if you get work experience with that postgraduate work permit, then you will get more points under the express entry program, because you'll be getting points for your job experience outside of Canada, and then you'll be getting points for your experience in your work experience in Canada. So that's the really good thing about having that postgraduate work permit. The other stream through which you can come to Canada is the visitor class, and that's for persons who want to come to Canada temporarily. You want to visit a relative, you want to come for a special occasion, someone is getting married, you want to come just for a vacation. You have to show that you have enough funds to support yourself during your stay, and generally you're allowed to stay in Canada for 6 months. So what happens is that when you enter Canada, sometimes the officer doesn't stamp the passport. If there isn't a stamp in your passport, you're allowed to stay in Canada for 6 months. You can extend your stay, but you have to extend your stay before that 6 months expires. If that 6 months expires, then you'll be out of status. You can apply for restoration of your status, but it's always good if you want to extend your stay to apply to extend it before your status expires. You don't want to be out of status. If you come into Canada, if let's say you come to visit and the officer at the port of entry puts a stamp in your passport, so you enter Canada on the 19th of January and the officer stamps the 30th of April, it means then you can't stay for 6 months. It means then you have to leave by that time. But as I mentioned, you can always apply to extend your stay in Canada. What some persons do for the visitor class is that they would send a letter of invitation to support the person who's coming, to support their application. So if I have a relative that I want to come to Canada, let's say to attend my graduation ceremony, I can send a letter of invitation which will support that person's application. There is also the Super Visa program, and the Super Visa program is for parents and grandparents. So for example, I mentioned earlier that you can sponsor a parent or grandparent, but you have to meet the income requirement. You must be earning a certain amount in order to bring that person to sponsor that person to live in Canada permanently. So let's say you don't have that, your income is not enough, then you may want to explore the Super Visa program because the income requirement is less. With this program, the person is allowed to stay in Canada for up to 2 years. So it's a little different from the normal visitor program, because as a visitor, you're limited to 6 months. But with this program, you can stay in Canada for up to 2 years. And what you can do is, let's say you've recently started working, you don't meet the income requirement to sponsor your parent or grandparent under this grandparent or grandparent sponsorship program, but you do meet the income requirement for the Super Visa. You can let them come to Canada through this program, and during that 2-year period, your income may increase, you may get a better job, and you may meet the requirements to bring that parent or grandparent to Canada to sponsor them during that 2-year period. There's also the temporary foreign worker program, and this is another temporary stream whereby persons come to Canada to work as to work as a temporary foreign worker. And generally with this program, you are required to get something called a labor market impact assessment. A labor market impact assessment is what your employer would have to obtain. And in lay terms, what this means is that the employer would have made efforts to hire a Canadian permanent resident or a Canadian citizen, and they did not find anyone to fill that vacancy, so they're now hiring someone outside of Canada. So generally, with coming to Canada to work as a temporary foreign worker, you would be required to obtain a labor market to have a labor market impact assessment to support your work permit application. There are, of course, exceptions to this. There are some programs that you do not need a work permit to come to Canada. And once again, the officer wants to know that you're going to leave Canada at once the time that you're permitted to work comes to an end. Of course, you can apply to extend your stay, and you do have to meet the eligibility requirements that I mentioned earlier. You have to be admissible to Canada. There's also some other programs which we would not go into today. There's the refugee program, and there's the humanitarian and compassionate program. So the refugee program is for persons who they're seeking refugee protection in Canada. You can either make a refugee claim at the port of entry, or you can be sponsored to come to Canada as a refugee. There's the humanitarian and compassionate program, and this is generally, most times it's for persons who are in Canada, but they've do not have status. They've lost status for different reasons, and they're asking the government to allow them to stay in Canada on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. These programs have different requirements. They all have different requirements. There's also something that is called a temporary resident permit. And let's say, for example, you're outside of Canada, you want to come to Canada, but you are inadmissible. What you can do is apply for a temporary resident permit. These applications are discretionary. It's up to the officer to make that decision whether or not they're going to approve that application. But a temporary resident permit really most times apply to persons who are inadmissible for different reasons: criminally inadmissible, medically inadmissible to Canada, or for misrepresentation. I do see that I have a few questions from some of the viewers, and one of those questions is if there is a job guarantee after arriving in Canada. I'm not sure what is meant by the question, but if you want to come to Canada as a worker, you first have to apply to a job. You have to get a job offer, and the person that is hiring you must obtain a labor market impact assessment. So if you're talking about coming to Canada to work temporarily, you must have a job offer. So you wouldn't be given a work permit if you're just saying, well, I want to come to Canada to work. You have to show that there is a job offer. You have to, of course, have your employer must have obtained a labor market impact assessment. And I explained what that is a bit earlier. And of course, there are exceptions to this. If you're speaking about getting a job after, being approved, let's say a permanent resident application is approved, that's different. If you're sponsored to come to Canada, then you would be able to work, and your permanent resident application is approved, you would be able to work with anyone. But if you want to come to Canada to work, you must have a job offer. It must be a genuine job offer also, because the officer reviewing your application is going to want to ensure that it's a genuine job offer. Canada does have, just to address another question that I'm seeing, Canada does have, there are good law schools in Canada. There's several law schools in Canada, and the same applies. If you apply to a law school in Canada, the school would have its own eligibility requirements for the students. That's different from the immigration process. If you apply to the school and you are accepted to that program and you have proof that you can pay your tuition and you can support yourself in Canada, then you can apply to come to Canada. You would first apply and you'd be issued a visa. If your application is approved, you'll be issued a visa, and then you'll get a study permit after. So there are good law schools in Canada. I addressed the question of cost earlier, and as I mentioned, it differs from program to program. There are two costs that's involved, and that's the cost that you pay to the government for the processing of your application, and then there's the cost that you pay to your representative, the lawyer that you've retained to assist you. With permanent residence application, you pay, there's something called the right of permanent residence fee. So for example, if you're applying to sponsor a spouse, you have to pay the processing fee to the government to process that application, and you also have to pay the right of permanent residence fee. The fees have recently increased as of the 30th of April of this year. I believe it wasn't increased for about 12 years, but they've recently increased it after about 12 years. And the fees for these programs, as I mentioned, it differs from program to program. There are a number of other things that are applicable to immigration law, such as overcoming and inadmissibility. If you're applying to come to Canada and for some reason you are inadmissible, let's say for example, you've committed an act years ago that Canada considers to be an offense, you can apply for rehabilitation, or you can ask for them to give you a waiver, to make an exception on your application based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. I do want to mention that nothing that was said in this presentation today is legal advice. This is a general overview of the ways that you can come to Canada. If you have a pending application or you would like to come to Canada, feel free to contact us at KYL Law Firm. I do want to stress the importance of retaining a authorized representative, because oftentimes I speak with clients who would have retained somebody that's not a lawyer, that was posing to be a lawyer, and then their application was not approved, or their application was returned. You want to ensure that you are retaining somebody who's qualified to assist you with your application, and there are ways to do that. So for example, if you're retaining a lawyer to assist you, and I'll use myself as an example, and my name is Kelicia. Kelicia Letlow, you can go on the Law Society's website and you can search my name, and on that website you'll be able to see whether or not I'm licensed to practice in Canada. So it's very important that you get legal assistance, one, so that you're not wasting your time, two, so that you're not wasting your money. A lot of persons invest a lot in seeking to come to Canada. As I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of persons seek admission to Canada every year, and you want to ensure that you're making a good investment in your future. And getting the assistance of an authorized representative will also help you with avoiding delays, having your application returned to you because it's incomplete. I hope that you would have gained something from this webinar today. And if you have questions about anything that I have mentioned today, if you're interested in coming to Canada or in sponsoring a family member to Canada, or you have a pending application, you can feel free to reach out to us at KYL Law Firm. I'm licensed to practice in the province of Ontario. My main area of practice is immigration law. Thank you once again for joining this webinar, and I hope you would have benefited from this session today. Thank you.